it is extremely likely that people born today will, on average, live to 1,000.
My dear friend Aubrey de Grey has been pushing for this for a long time, even though he was called by my alma mater, MIT. Technology Review from MIT called him a charlatan, a crazy guy in 2005. And then in 14 years later, MIT changed its mind and it said old age is over.
In February of 2023, LEV Foundation launched the most ambitious mouse lifespan experiment in history. It's the first study in our robust mouse rejuvenation research program in collaboration with our partners at iCore Life Sciences.
What do you think are the most promising therapies, the most exciting strategies currently being researched that could help us achieve ending aging?
We will be able to re-rejuvenate the same people and take them back to being biologically 40 or 30 again.
What will be the social, maybe economical result of just accepting or considering aging as a disease?
Can you tell us what happened in 2005? What was the controversy about in the MIT Technology Review?
In 2000, when I had the kind of eureka moment of understanding that
Dr. Aubrey de Grey is a biomedical gerontologist based in Silicon Valley, California, USA, and is the founder, president, and chief science officer of LEV Foundation, a biomedical research and advocacy charity focused on repairing the molecular and cellular damage of aging. He received his BA in computer science and PhD in biology from the University of Cambridge. His research interests encompass the characterization of all the types of damage that constitute mammalian aging and the design of interventions to repair and/or obviate that damage. Dr. de Grey is a fellow of both the Gerontological Society of America and the American Aging Association, and sits on the editorial and scientific advisory boards of numerous journals and organizations. He is a highly sought-after speaker who gives frequent invited talks at scientific conferences, universities, companies in areas ranging from pharma to life insurance and to the public.
I'm hugely grateful to everybody who has come together to make this groundbreaking study possible, and most of all to the supporters, the donors who gave the funds to make it possible. We're raising funds now for the second study in this research program, which we're calling RMR2, and which we hope to launch as soon as possible in 2024. Please go to our website and make your gift today. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of HealthGevity podcast. Today, we have an amazing guest that needs no introduction. But before that, I have to tell you that today also we have Dr. Jose Luis Cordeiro, my friend and the co-founder of HealthGevity Nation, and futurist also with us. So we have a guest that we want to talk about longevity and a lot of other topics around it. So let's welcome Dr. Aubrey de Grey. Welcome, Dr. Aubrey.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much. So let me start with myself. That first time I heard about you was from the book, actually, that Ending Aging. It was like 2008, but you wrote it in 2007. But before that, I read another book, Fantastic Voyage, but your book was, for me, something really different. So, and after that, I actually searched a lot about you, and I found an interview from BBC. So in that interview, actually, you said something that was very interesting for me. I mean, it was like 20 so years ago. And you said that, we will be able to live 1,000 years. And this was the title of the interview. And it was 20 years ago. So do you still think the same, that we really can live up to 1,000 or, of course, maybe more?
I'm quite sure that in due course, we will develop sufficiently comprehensive medicine to control aging that we will be able to live indefinitely. The number 1,000 was just a convenient number to use to describe how long the average person would live if we didn't have any death from aging, but all of the other risks of death that we currently have in the Western world today remained at the same level that they are right now. So no reduction in road accidents and things like that. So, of course, that means that, in fact, a number like 1,000, which is what you can come up with just by mathematics on the statistics that exist today, that number is grossly over pessimistic because, of course, the risks of death from causes that don't have to do with how long ago you were born are going to come down over time. Nevertheless, it was quite dramatic enough to get people's attention. And yes, absolutely, it's perfectly clear that this is going to happen. And everyone who understands even basic mathematics can see it once they understand that the way in which we are going to progressively bring aging under control is by rejuvenation. In other words, damage repair, making people biologically younger rather than just slowing down the rate at which they get biologically older. Now, this is something that, of course, was also very radical back then. It was a big paradigm shift in the field, but it's now, in the past decade or so, especially since the publication of this famous paper, The Hallmarks of Aging, it's become a very established mainstream way of thinking about the whole thing.
Fantastic. Yeah, I remember when you wrote the book, it was like, 8 hallmarks or somehow damages that we had. And now we have more than 14, 15, even 16. Do you think that it can just increase? We know more. And what has changed during the past 20 years? What is something that now you know that you didn't know, let's say 20 years ago, that could change many things, probably in even writing your book?
Yeah, so the fact that we keep adding new hallmarks is kind of a it kind of tells you that the way in which hallmarks are being defined today has something wrong with it. The hallmarks as I described them, which I didn't call them hallmarks, I called them, categories of damage,
Right.
have not actually increased at all. There are still 7 of them, same as there were back then. And the reason is that I went about it in a rather different way than people have done so recently. What I did was that I was interested in classifying the many, many types of molecular and cellular damage that accumulate in the body as a side effect of normal metabolism into a manageable number of categories, such that for each category there was some kind of generic damage repair approach. So, for example, cell loss, cells dying and not being automatically replaced by cell division. The generic approach to fixing that is stem cell therapy, right? So replacing cells that the body is not replacing on its own. Now, today, we also have the additional possibility of using partial reprogramming for this, which is a technique that makes cells that are already in the body more stem-like again, if they have lost some of their stemness. And this is going quite well also. So that's an alternative way, but it doesn't change the number of categories. There's still one category, cell loss. And similarly across the board. So if you look at the hallmarks paper, the original one back in 2013, where they had 9 hallmarks, actually it was less complete than my original thing from a decade earlier. One big thing that was missing, for example, was the loss of elasticity of the extracellular matrix. And that's something that has been reintroduced in more recent versions of the hallmarks papers. But still, the hallmarks papers of the past 10 years are really more of a classification of types of research, of areas to research. They don't adequately marry up the types of damage with the types of intervention. And so I still prefer my own classification.
Yeah,
wonderful, Aubrey.
yeah, Jose,
And yeah, let me continue. And also tell you that I love your book as well in Spanish.
Okay.
So I reviewed it when it came out, of course, after the English edition earlier in 2007. And I am also very happy that I have known you for about 20 years. I think we met in person in 2004. So that's 20 years ago, long, long time ago. There was only one conference in the world about longevity, life extension, rejuvenation, which was your SENS conference in Cambridge 20 years ago. And now there are at least 20 conferences in the planet. So it has grown exponentially. Anyway, so I'm also happy that you wrote the prologue of my book, The Death of Death, that has been translated by Dr. Dana Marduk, first into Arabic, now into Persian, and soon into Kurdish. So even the book is now becoming popular in the Middle East. So I am very grateful to you, Dana, for the translations, and to Aubrey for his beautiful prologue. And now I have a question, because one of the things that you talk about in the book and before and after is longevity escape velocity. So what is longevity escape velocity, and when do you think we will reach that point?
Okay. First of all, let me also mention that my book, Ending Aging, has been translated into quite a few languages as well. Yeah, that's the Spanish one, of course. It's been translated into Japanese and German and Italian and Portuguese and one or two other languages. So anyone who wants to read it in their own language, there are ways to do that.
Fantastic. Sorry to interrupt you. Just a question. Do you think, do you have it in Persian language?
I don't think so. If you email me after this, I will look into that.
Well, so the question is this: do you think still this book, after like more than 20 years, do you still is relevant, or maybe some changes actually we have that maybe it's not that much?
So it's definitely relevant. As I mentioned, the hallmarks as I defined them are still the same ones. So there's still 7 things. Furthermore, all of the original approaches to damage repair, to fixing those various categories of damage, are still very much on the table. There is one big thing that has happened, which I alluded to a moment ago, namely that for each of the 7 categories, there are now additional alternative ways that we might go about fixing them. And some of those things definitely need to be addressed. So there is now a pretty good case for writing a sequel to Ending Aging, and one day I might get around to it. But that's the main difference. So certainly the book is still very much, it has stood the test of time. So to come back to Jose's question about longevity escape velocity, yeah. So this is another idea that I put forward about 20 years ago. And indeed, it is also now the name of my current organization, Lely Foundation. And the reason it's so important is because it's really the last part of the logic that leads to this prediction that people who are alive today even have a fair chance of living as long as 1,000 years. I do not think that within the next, let's say, 50 years, we have really any chance at all of bringing aging under 100% comprehensive medical control, figuring out medicines that can repair absolutely every type of molecular and cellular damage that the body does to itself. But the concept of longevity escape velocity explains why we don't need to get to that point in order to get the consequences, the equivalent consequences of the situation if we were at that point. How it goes like this. If you take someone who is aged, let's say 60, and let's say that they're an average 60-year-old, which means that their biological age is also 60, right? And we have a somewhat comprehensive, but not completely comprehensive panel of interventions that can repair some of the damage in their body. So let's say that the types of damage that the panel can repair are going to be called the easy damage, and the rest are going to be called the difficult damage. Then if we repair the easy damage, of course we can repair it as often as we like. So for practical purposes, anybody who is receiving these therapies will have no easy damage in their body anymore, only difficult damage. And of course, that means that immediately after getting these treatments the first time, their biological age, as defined by the total amount of damage in their body, will be younger than it was before they got the treatments. So let's say they're going to be biologically 40. But then as time goes on, even though they're getting these treatments all the time, they will still be accumulating difficult damage. So eventually they're going to get back to being biologically 60, and then they're going to carry on and become biologically 80 and so on. And they're going to get sick and die like the same way we do today. It's just that they will do so at a later age. I mean, of course, later age is a really good thing, but it's not good enough. So maybe we'll get like an extra 20 years of healthy life out of these therapies, but that's not going to get anyone to live to 1,000. So what's the next step? Well, the next step is that 20 years is a very long time in technology. and in particular in biomedical technology. So in those 20 years, people like me are going to have been continuing to improve the comprehensiveness of these damage repair treatments. So that by the time 20 years has gone by and this person's 80, but they're biologically 60 for the second time, some of that stuff that was classified as difficult damage is no longer going to be in that category. It's going to be in the easy damage category. So actually, we will be able to re-rejuvenate the same people and take them back to being biologically 40 or 30 again on account of those improvements that have been made. So that they won't be biologically 60 for the third time until they're 110 or whatever, and so on. So in other words, we can define a concept called longevity escape velocity, which is the minimum rate at which the biomedical research community will need to continue to improve the comprehensiveness of these treatments in order that people who are at any point getting state-of-the-art treatments will stay one step ahead of the problem and will not have enough damage in their body to make them sick. That is all longevity escape velocity is. And I believe that we can get there, but that we can get to that point of being able to stay one step ahead of the problem when we have achieved the first 20 years or so of postponement of the health problems of late life. And I believe that we have a 50% chance of getting there within the next 12 to 15 years from now. So the second half of the 2030s. Now, once we're there, great. But of course, we might not get there. And as I say, it's only a 50% chance that I predict. I think there is maybe a 5 or 10% chance that we won't get there for 100 years if we hit a whole bunch of, unanticipated obstacles. But so the hell what? A 50% chance is quite enough to be worth fighting for.
Yeah, fantastic. So you mentioned that, in 20 years, actually, we are going to have a lot of technological advancement. Just a few years ago, nobody could believe that AI within just 2 to 3 years becomes so democratized and available for almost everyone. So probably in the next 5 to 10 years, as Ray Kurzweil in the book Singularity is nearer, the last book actually is talking about the singularity and the technological convergence. Probably we're going to have some advancement in biology and longevity that even now we cannot imagine it. So you talked about LEV Foundation. I would like to ask you a question about this. So you have a project called Robust Mouse Rejuvenation. A little bit tell us more about that project and how it is different from any other projects in the field. And what do you see this project that the results in the next 3 to 5 years?
Yeah, okay, I'm certainly going to talk about that. But actually, before I do, let me pick up on something in the middle of your question, which was you mentioned that AI and the benefits of what's already been achieved in AI are being seen very widely. People all over the world are benefiting from those advances. A lot of people are very worried that this will not be the case for advances against aging, advances in longevity, that it will be available only to the rich or whatever. And I think it's very, very important to dispel that misconception because the fact is, it's very expensive to let people get sick when they get old. Very expensive indeed. So it's going to be in everybody's interest, whether the private sector, whether governments, whatever, just the straightforward mercenary economic incentive, forgetting about any moral or humanitarian incentive, to make sure that these treatments are available to absolutely everybody almost as soon as they are available to anybody. It's very, very important that people should understand that. And of course, I would love for a lot of preparation to be happening now, anticipating that, because the more front loading of investment and preparation is done, the more we will be able to kick into gear when these treatments start to come on stream, so as to really minimize that delay between getting these things available and getting them available to everybody. All right, so I'm back to your question about robust mouse rejuvenation. So yes, I have always, in my work over the past 20 or more years, chosen my focus on the basis of neglect. In other words, I look at what needs to be done, and I then don't just say, okay, what is the most important thing? I say, what is the most important thing relative to how much effort is being applied to it at the moment? And if I find that there are things that are being very poorly addressed for their level of importance, those are the things that I've always focused on. So what that has meant in the Methuselah Foundation and Sense Research Foundation, my first two organizations, is that we've focused on the most difficult types of damage to repair, because the ones that were easier to repair are ones that other people were already working on quite happily. And I'm very proud that a number of quite important areas of progress were made in my organizations, which led to the spinning out of half a dozen projects as startup companies, some of which have moved very nicely. One of them is about to be sold to Big Pharma. You know, it's all like it was what I wanted to achieve with that approach. But the thing about damage repair is there are hallmarks. Which, another way of saying that is it's a divide and conquer approach. You've got a bunch of different types of damage you've got to repair. And you'd better damn repair all of them, or at least you'd better repair all of them fairly well. As I was mentioning earlier, you don't have to repair them all perfectly, um, but fairly well, or one or other of them that you're not addressing is going to knock you on the head, not long after you were going to die anyway. So that's why I focused on the difficult damage. But since it's a divide and conquer approach, and since that's more or less, got a life of its own now, there are only a few things left that are still, if you like, pre-investable in that department. What remains is the last part, which is putting all these things together in the same individual at the same time. And that is something that is very much being neglected right now for the usual reasons. It's not the kind of thing that is easy to make money out of until it really works properly. And so it's not very investable. It's also not the kind of thing that gets you high profile papers in Science and Nature and Cell, because it's like, it's not testing hypotheses really. And therefore it's not fashionable. It's neglected by academia as well. So that's why it falls to me again. So in LEV Foundation, that's what we're focusing on. And we have a research program, a sequence of experiments that will address this, the first of which is ongoing, started 18 months ago. So these experiments take a particular form. What we do is we take a lot of mice. In general, we take 1,000 mice. And we start with mice that are already in middle age. So what that means is they're about a year and a half old. These are for mice that normally live about 2.5 years. All right. And then we throw a whole bunch of things at them, 4 different things. The reason we need so many mice is because we want to find out as much as possible. And that means we want to have mice that are getting all these treatments and mice that are getting none of them, but we also want mice that are getting only one of them or all but one or whatever, so that we can extract a lot of information. And that's what we did with 4 different treatments. And it's gone really, really well. The main highlight right now is, and I say right now because the experiment is not over yet, there are still some mice alive, is that in male mice, which in this particular strain happen to live longer than females, that's a bit unusual. But in male mice, there is definitely an additivity there. We are seeing that if you put 2 treatments together or 4 treatments together, you get better results than if you only have one. And we want obviously to continue this. The difficulty is that these experiments are very expensive, and the manner of the expense is very much not in line with the way that most normal government agencies and so on tend to fund things, because pretty much all the money has to be spent at the beginning. That's because, first of all, you've got to buy the mice. Obviously, that's at the beginning, but also the treatments, because they are damage repair treatments, you do them once at 18 months of age, and then all you have is the relatively low expense of simply keeping the mice alive and monitoring their health and things like that. So, yeah, basically we need a few $1 million in the bank before we can pull the trigger to get an experiment going. And that's what we did have at the beginning of LEV Foundation, substantially thanks to Vitalik Buterin, as well as to some of the donors to Sense Research Foundation, who were able to make up the rest by extracting it. But we won't talk about that anymore. The main thing is that this experiment is coming to an end, but we're ready to do the next one. We've been ready for at least 9 months now, and we haven't had the money to do it, which is very sad. Lives are being lost as a result of the lack of funding to get this experiment going. And we definitely want to kick off as many of these experiments as possible as soon as possible, because there's no shortage of potential interventions that already individually show great promise in mice and therefore are great candidates for being combined.
Wow, this is
Fantastic.
fantastic.
Yeah. So Aubrey, let me now ask you about the controversy with the MIT Technology Review. Since I'm a graduate myself from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I followed that very dearly. And I didn't like when in 2005, they kind of made fun of you. And then luckily the same magazine, the MIT Technology Review in 2019, they basically said that old age is over if you want it. So in 14 years, MIT radically changed its ideas about longevity. But can you tell us what happened in 2005? What was the controversy about in the MIT Technology Review?
Sure. So, in 2000, when I had the kind of eureka moment of understanding that damage repair was the way to go, the first problem I had was that this was a huge paradigm shift as compared to the prevailing way of thinking within the academic community working on aging. Everybody was focused on slowing aging down, on trying to, if you like, make our metabolism run more cleanly so that it doesn't create these various types of damage at the rate that it naturally does. And people had pretty much given up on the idea that we were ever going to be able to do that, or at least significantly do it. So, basically, the field was not a biomedical field at all. It was a biological research field, a curiosity-driven field, where you could not mention doing anything about aging in a grant application at all. There was no way you would get funded if you did that. And that had gradually changed a little bit, courtesy of some results, especially the paper in 1993 by Cynthia Kenyon, who was able to double the lifespan of nematode worms. But at the end of the day, that was a false dawn, and most people knew it, but they didn't say it. They knew that really all that was being done here was new ways to activate the process that all species activate when they're in a famine. And unfortunately, that process, that result gives a very nice life extension in nematode worms and a fairly nice life extension in mice, but a very poor amount of life extension in long-lived species like humans. So, you wouldn't talk about intervention at all. And insofar as anyone wanted to talk about intervention, they were, as I say, thinking in terms of slowing aging down. And I pointed out that damage repair is a way that's much more practical, and it's much better than slowing aging down because it's beneficial to people who are already old. It actually takes the clock back rather than just slowing the clock down. And this was a very, very hard sell. It took me really best part of 10 years to get the community to take it seriously. And of course, eventually in 2013, that was the real end of that period, because that was when the Hallmarks paper came out, which is essentially a restatement of what I'd said more than a decade earlier, albeit not a perfect restatement. And so I've never had to justify this idea within the academic community ever since. But 2005 was smack in the middle of the time when this was by no means true. And honestly, journalists had started getting interested in me over the previous couple of years. And they had started, contacting my esteemed colleagues and asking them what they thought about this whole sense idea. And of course, my esteemed colleagues hadn't really studied it because they thought it was nonsense and unscientific and couldn't be right. So they were kind of, there was a lot of, let's call it off the record ridicule going on. And I needed to put a stop to that. We all know the kind of things that Gandhi and Arthur C. Clarke and people have said about the stages of acceptance of a radical idea. So I wanted to move from the ridicule stage to the opposition stage. So I actually, I kind of deliberately picked a fight or two in the academic community, especially towards the end of 2004, when I was kind of invited to do so by a group in Heidelberg. And the result was I was successful. Various people got very angry, and I was able to exploit that in collaboration with Technology Review. Because what happened was that Jason Pontin, the editor back then, started out thinking I was crazy, but after being forced by his readership to look into it in more detail, because the first thing he published was essentially a denunciation of me that didn't have any actual scientific substance to it. Um, he found out that nobody was willing to actually explain, at least not in print, why I was wrong. And he felt that he'd been hoodwinked. And so he worked with me to create this thing called the Sense Challenge, in which both he and I put up $10,000 each to reward anyone who could come up with something that an independent, neutral panel of experts would view as a demonstration that the sense concept was unscientific, was not worthy of scientific debate. Um, and the neutral experts were an interesting group. Jason found most of them. That he was looking for people who were not in the biology of aging, but who did have a grasp of how to evaluate technology. And he found four good people. Two of them were very senior people, not in biology at all, Nathan Myhrvold and Roger Schank, I think it was. Um, and two of them were youngsters, people who were just coming into the field. Again, not gerontologists, but they were biologists, biotechnologists. But very good people. And I found the last person, which was Craig Venter, who took a little persuading to get involved, but eventually he said, yeah, he would do it. And so it all happened. And I was pretty sure that none of my colleagues would be so unwise as to submit an entry, but I was wrong. It turned out that one of my colleagues, a guy named Pete Estap, together with a bunch of people that he was able to, basically call in favors from, um, uh, submitted an entry, which was spectacularly useless and flawed. And of course, the structure of the competition was that I was able to write a rebuttal, and sure enough, that was that. It was not considered to be a demonstration that sense was unscientific. By this time, however, Jason had decided that he really, felt that I probably was wrong and my ideas probably were unscientific, but simply because he didn't like the conclusion that people would live to 1,000. And so even though the whole thing had completely backfired and exploded in his face, he decided to continue to, give much more prominence to the anti-sense ideas than to the sense ideas. He actually gave his $10,000 anyway, even though the prize had not been won. It was a little bit tawdry, to be honest. And so, yeah, that was the position that MIT Technology Review took until Jason retired and handed over the editorship to somebody else, at which point people started to pay attention to the fact that I had been demonstrated to be correct. And here we are.
Yeah, that was really interesting to know the details actually of this story. But we in HealthGevity Nation, Aubrey, we are actually working with, let's say, normal people. One of our main goal is to democratize health and longevity. So when you talk to some people about ending aging, and we can achieve actually this, even let's say in 20, 30, even in 50 years, they really cannot understand it. And it's not only normal people without academic background. Even sometimes you talk to academics, some MDs, and they don't see it something plausible. So I want to ask you, it's like 17 years that you have written the book Ending Aging. How much do you think we are close to this? And how would you describe the whole thing, the whole process, or that achievement that we are going to have sooner or later to someone that maybe does not have that academic background? How this is possible if you want to explain it very, in a simple way to them?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There's still a long way to go to solve that problem. And unfortunately, a huge part of the reason why there's still such a long way to go and why progress has been so slow is that my colleagues within the biology of aging make it harder. they are the academics in the gerontology field. They get their money from places like the National Institute on Aging. In other words, from places where the dogma is that there is this thing called aging, which is somehow distinct from the diseases like cancer or atherosclerosis and so on. And so, in order to carry on, getting money from places like that, my colleagues feel that that they have to pretend that there's this thing called aging that's distinct from everything else. And that is hugely damaging in the long term and also, to be honest, in the short term these days. Because what it does is it cements, it entrenches the idea in the minds of non-scientists, especially, that aging is not a medical problem. That it's some inherently different thing that is,
Natural process.
well, not just natural. Disease is natural. That's not the
Yeah,
point.
but
The point is
most of
that
people still they don't see that yeah, cancer is natural and aging is natural, but they
yeah,
see it a
being
good
natural.
natural thing.
Yeah, no, no, natural is not the point here. Yes, they think it's natural, but they understand that diseases are natural, but they also understand that diseases are bad, and that therefore, it makes sense to throw money at figuring out how to fix them, because they believe that, some people get this for any particular disease, some people get, some people don't. Therefore, it seems, intuitively the case that we ought to be able to apply medicine so that the people who do get it don't get it, right? You just have to develop that medicine. And that's an intuitively sensible thing to think. But they think about aging as somehow woven into the fabric of the universe in some way that makes it inherently not amenable to to medicine, even in theory, however far in the future we might look. And so they are not in favor of throwing more money at it, for example. They may think, well, let's throw money at it purely in the hope that we might find out things that have side benefits somehow, in the same way that we throw money at cosmology. We're not expecting to do anything about galaxies, but we find things out by studying the world, right? So that's a really big problem. And so I, of course, try to demystify aging. I say, listen, that's the wrong way to think about aging. The right way to think about it is to go back to the fact that the body is a machine, and therefore its function is determined by its structure, and that its structure changes spontaneously as a consequence of its normal operation, same as any simple man-made machine, which means that the changes that happen that are eventually bad for you just cause the health problems of late life. So I always describe aging in this very simple way as the combination of these two processes: the lifelong one, where the operation of the body and metabolism generates these various changes at the molecular and cellular level that are initially harmless for a long, long time because the body is set up to tolerate a certain amount of such change. And then when that amount is exceeded, then we kick off the second process, which is the emergence and progression of the chronic health problems of late life, the so-called diseases of aging. So saying that these two things are completely different and that aging is one of them, maybe, but really generally not defining aging at all is a huge problem. And I absolutely feel that my colleagues in the academic community are to blame for this. I've been saying this for 20 odd years, and they carry on doing it because they know which side their bread is currently buttered and they can't see beyond that.
Fantastic.
Very good points, Aubrey. And today, right now, what do you think are the most promising therapies, the most exciting strategies currently being researched that could help us achieve ending aging?
Well, I mean, how long do you have? I mean, of course, there are many, many. I mentioned already that the situation with the 7 categories has greatly improved over the past 20 years, especially over the past 10 years, with the emergence of alternative approaches that may end up being easier to implement than the ones I talked about in my book. So every time anyone comes up with a new way to repair some kind of damage, that's exciting, very exciting, because that new way may end up being easier to implement in mice and then in humans, than the ones that we thought of before. Uh, let's take mitochondrial mutations. That's one of the areas. It's the area I got into first. It's actually there are actually, unlike all of the other six categories, that one has two chapters dedicated to it in my book. Um, and look, yeah, the first chapter is really one about which is chapter 5 of the book, is really about how this thing happens, which is kind of how I got started in this whole area. And the second chapter, chapter 6, is about what to do about it. But the point is, my approach was really, really complicated, and very ambitious. And even though I started funding research into it in 2005, we've got a great deal further than anyone thought was possible. We've still got a long way to go to make it work. So it's extremely important that now there are a couple of other approaches. In fact, I would say there are three main other approaches that are very much worth pursuing, that are being pursued, and that may work very much sooner than my original approach. This is the main thing that excites me.
Fantastic. So regarding your previous answer, actually about academics and also uh, the problem of it, aging itself. Some people see it as a problem, but it's a kind of controversial. I mean, for example, David Sinclair see it absolutely as a disease, and some other people say no, there would be some consequences to that. I personally say that even if from the scientific point of view we do not consider it as a disease, still I think we should be able to consider it as a disease, since I think it will have a lot of positive impacts. So, what do you think? I mean, what will be the social, maybe economical result of just accepting or considering aging as a disease?
Right. So, I mean, the only reservation that I have historically had with regard to calling aging a disease is that it sounds like it could be cured. So for me, the word disease is conventionally used to describe something that either is an infection, something that people get as from an external source, or it's something congenital. In other words, something that a few of us get because of the genes we've got, but most of us don't have any risk of getting it. Or the third type, of course, is the diseases of late life, which to my mind should not be called diseases. I would prefer if the way in which the word disease were used were made narrower, not broader. I would prefer cancer and atherosclerosis and so on not to be called diseases, because they're actually the later stages of aging, right?
Right.
Um, but sometimes one can be a little bit too rigorous about terminology. So, maybe David's right to just bite the fucking bullet and call aging a disease. Certainly, I call aging a medical problem. I emphasize that it is amenable to medical intervention. And that's, of course, what calling aging a disease is designed to communicate. But yeah, I mean, you're right that if you don't call aging a disease, then you're in danger of people saying, well, it's not a disease. And that, of course, has its own incorrect ramifications, in particular the one you alluded to a moment ago, namely that people start to make excuses for aging and figure out, stupid arguments that imply that aging is some kind of blessing in disguise.
Absolutely.
And we have a huge amount to do to dispel that. We have, of course, the enormous burden of the entertainment industry, which constantly makes movies and so on about a post-aging world and makes it, apocalyptic and dystopian in one way or another, generally on the basis of things that we all know are complete nonsense, like the risk of overpopulation or the risk of, it being only available to the rich, which I talked about earlier. Yeah, it's very annoying. But yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, the argument is more or less done, as in there's now masses of money coming into the field to actually address aging as a medical problem and to bring it under medical control. So, that problem, even though it still exists in society, is pretty much in the past. The problem now is that the money that is coming in is tragically unevenly distributed. There is a lot of money going into some areas and virtually nothing going into equally vital areas that don't really need very much money. You know, a few million here, a few tens of millions there would
Let
be
me give an
quite enough.
example. Sorry, that in this about this one.
Sure. So, some of the areas of you know, developing the early stages of difficult damage, like mitochondrial mutations or extracellular matrix cross-linking and so on. These are things which have got far enough that there are a few companies now, but these companies are very small. You know, they're being like funded by angel investors, and that's all. And that's, you know, a great deal better than nothing. But, you know, 10 times more money in those fields would very much accelerate what's being done. Money is definitely the rate limiter for those things.
Right.
The work that we're doing at LEV Foundation is perhaps the single biggest example because nobody is doing combinations of damage repair interventions at all. Some people have finally got the message that we need to be doing interventions starting late in life, you know, so they're more relevant to people who pay taxes, and that's happening. And some people have got the message that we need to do stuff with combinations. But unfortunately, either they're only doing single therapies late in life, or they're doing combinations, but they're not starting late in life. Or even if they're doing both of those, they're doing the combinations of the wrong things. They're only looking at orally available stuff, small molecules, um, and not looking at cell therapies and gene therapies, which are absolutely indispensable for all of this. So we are unique. LEV Foundation is absolutely unique in pursuing what really most needs to be pursued. And, you know, we've got no money.
Right. Jose, over to you.
Okay, so let me go back into the past because you have created three foundations. Your first foundation, the Methuselah Foundation, created also a mouse prize, a mice prize, okay, which was the Methuselah Mouse Prize. Can you tell us about that and why did it not continue? And if that is related to your robust mouse rejuvenation prize today?
So yeah, so back then we had no money at all for anything. And so all we could really do in 2003, when Dave Goebel and I started the Methuselah Foundation, was PR, was to raise the profile of longevity research and make it you know, interesting to the general public. And Dave had already decided that prizes were a very cool way to go. So we created these things. One of them was a kind of very simplistic headline prize saying, okay, beat the world record for mouse lifespan any way you like, you know, you can mess about genetically and so on, and we'll give you some money. And the second prize was you've got to actually do this in a way that's relevant. And so we said, first of all, it's got to be a published study. So you can't just do one mouse. You've got to do it with a reasonable number. Second of all, you've got to start late in life. So middle age or whatever. But within that scope, you can do anything. And then for both prizes, what we did was we said, okay, the amount you get depends on how much money we have in the bank. So we were encouraging people to increase the amount that we had in the bank. And the amount that you get is a proportion of what we have in the bank that is determined by how much you beat the previous record by. Okay. So we had to have an initial baseline, of course. What was the record at the time we started? In the case of the simplistic prize, it was 1,819 days, which is 1 week shy of 5 years. And that was a mouse with a knockout of a gene called the growth hormone receptor. So that was all very well. And then the second prize, the best thing was calorie restriction done starting at 18 or 19 months of age. Neither of those records have been beaten yet. Now, we're not really interested in the first record, as I said. We're interested in the second one. And we're pretty sure we can beat it, but we haven't beaten it yet. So it's definitely got relevance to the robust mouse rejuvenation projects. However, the key thing about why these prizes are no longer really prioritized is because, you know, things have moved on to they've basically done their job. You know, we don't really need that kind of PR anymore. The biggest demonstration that we don't is that now, of course, we have a human prize for rejuvenation, the HealthSpan X prize, which It's called HealthSpan, but it's a rejuvenation prize through and through. I was the main orchestrator, the main overseer of the design of the prize from the biology point of view, and it's got my fingerprints all over it. So it's very much what we need right now. Peter Diamandis actually knew Dave Goebel before I knew Dave Goebel. So the X Prize Foundation was created at the same time as the Methuselah Foundation, and Peter was our first business advisor back in '03. And since like '07 or so, he and I have been talking about creating a human X Prize, a human longevity X Prize. Um, and gradually it became possible with advances that were made. And eventually money came in from Sergey Young and Michael Antonoff, especially to fund the design process. So here we are. We've now got a prize, which is $101 million. Much of it provided by Hevolution, much of it provided by a guy named Chip Wilson, who was the founder of Lululemon. And in fact, Peter Diamandis himself put in $5 million into the prize pot, which is 10 times more than he's put into any other X Prize. So that shows how committed he is. So yeah, I mean, that's where we are right now. And that prize, it's looking at getting 10 or 20 years of rejuvenation with interventions that are administered over a period of no more than 1 year. So that's proper rejuvenation. So here we are.
Fantastic. So my last question, actually, probably you know that Jose and I, we have founded HealthGevity Nation as an organization that our main goal is bring the science of longevity for, let's say, just normal people, even for students, young generation, Gen Z, Gen Alpha even. And we have had some activities around the world, and now we are even taking this science by, making it in just like simplify it and taking it to school. So children from right now, they try to learn, and those who are interested can continue in this field. What do you think, and what is your approach if we want to bring the science into normal people? Because now you know that a lot of people, they care more about their health by changing their lifestyle, but still, we talk to a lot of people, they haven't heard of even the word longevity or what we can do actually about it. So what do you think about the whole idea?
So the younger generation are absolutely vital here, and I'm delighted that you're doing this. I have always found that it is much easier to bring young people on board with all of this, largely because, they haven't lost the ability to aim high. They haven't spent decades being ground down by failure like most middle-aged people have. And so that's really important. And also they haven't decided what to do with their lives. They haven't got responsibilities that sap the amount of time they have available. So the younger generation is absolutely vital. And I am delighted that you've done this, that you're doing this. I work with a number of other people who are thinking the same kind of way. For example, there's an organization now focused on undergraduates, which, especially in the US, but it wants to broaden. I should put you in touch with them. That's
Sure.
being led by actually the brother of the person who leads the most important US-based policy organization in the field, the Alliance for Longevity Initiatives. He got into this a couple of years ago, and he was persuaded his brother to do something as well, and his brother decided to work with students. So that's an organization that you definitely have a natural, affiliation with, and you should definitely be communicating with that guy, with those guys.
Yeah, fantastic.
Anything else I can do to help you? Yeah,
Yeah,
anything
thank
else I
you.
can do to help you move this forward? Another thing, of course, there are organizations focused on youngsters, on high achieving youngsters getting into these kinds of fields elsewhere in the world. There's a venture fund called 1517, which came out of the TL Empire,
Mhm.
run by Danielle Strackman and Mike Gibson. You ought to be talking to them because they're focused on companies being led by teenagers. There's an organization based out of Canada whose name I'm forgetting now, but that's also been pushing this forward. Not These two organizations are not focused on longevity exclusively by any means, but they have a big longevity component. So again, that's what you need to do in order to make a
Yep.
success of what you're doing is to ally yourself and communicate with organizations that are doing related things.
Yes, Aubrey, and this is part of the ideas that we have with HealthGevity Nation in every country. Here in Spain, also I work with young people. In fact, you might remember that in the Spanish edition of my bestseller, we have been donated all the royalties, all the income to two foundations, one to your former foundation, the Sense Research Foundation, and the other half to a local foundation in Spain for young people who go and study these big issues like longevity, life extension. So yes, we are totally in agreement. This is important to reach young people. And for young people and for you, therefore, I have my final question, because now we are in the time of artificial intelligence. Everybody has heard about ChatGPT, and many students use it all the time. So how do you think that AI will help in terms of life expansion? How can we use AI to accelerate this, and how do you see this happening in the next few years?
There are many ways. So the easiest way to talk, the easiest example to talk about is the application of AI to enabling technologies that generally apply across the whole of biomedical research, not just aging. The most conspicuous case of that, of course, is AlphaFold, which solved the problem of the three-dimensional structure of proteins based on their amino acid sequence. But there's plenty of potential for other things like that that will accelerate, enabling in the sense of accelerating work that we can already do, but it's really slow and expensive. Beyond that, there are definitely uses of AI already happening with regard to drug discovery, with regard to the acquisition of new ways to design drugs arising from patterns that humans would not be able to see in existing data. And that, that's been the basis for the success of silico medicine and BioAge, which are arguably the two biggest they are the two biggest companies led by proper longevists in the field right now. So this is definitely happening. As for going forward, I think the key thing is we have to first of all get better AI. At the moment, there's a lot of interest in the wider world in things like ChatGPT, large language models, but everybody knows that on their own, large language models have severe limitations in terms of their ability to extract, to derive new information accurately. Essentially, they don't think. They just read a lot. But of course, the reason why we are seeing breakthroughs all the time is precisely because people are taking that technology and combining it with other ways to use machine learning and getting a great deal more than the sum of the parts. So that's definitely happening. The question then is, what's missing? And the fundamental thing that's missing is data, and that's for two reasons. One reason is access to data that already exists. There's an awful lot of large volumes of data that's very useful, that's tied up in the vaults of big pharma because it's proprietary and they don't want it used, even though they're not using it themselves because they don't know how. And that's a problem that can be solved by throwing money at it, and that's definitely happening. So that's great. However, there's a second problem, which is related, namely anonymization. Vast amounts of data exist that have been acquired as a result on condition of anonymity, and that anonymity therefore needs to be maintained and preserved, for legal reasons, apart from anything else. Now there are ways to extract information from anonymized data using AI, using basically encryption. And this is now pretty established, so it's no longer a barrier, but it's still often perceived to be a barrier by people who are kind of not keeping up and who are, perhaps not incentivized enough to look for solutions to this problem. However, that's all just one side of the data access problem. The other problem is giving AI data that doesn't exist at all yet, and I believe that is absolutely essential. At the moment, there is a really alarming tendency for a number of people, including a number of people like Sam Altman, who have very deep pockets and who have put proper money into aging research in the past, to walk away from wet lab work, to actually say, well, okay, AI is all we need now. We'll throw money at AI, we'll get the data out of the vaults of Big Pharma and so on, and we'll just solve the problem. We won't need any more experiments. This is spectacularly short-sighted. It assumes, it makes the absolute article of faith that the kinds of data that we have are enough, and we just need more of the same kinds of data, which is, I'm not saying I know for 100% certain that it's not true, but I sure as hell know that it might very well not be true. And throwing a very small amount of money at the acquisition of types of data that definitely don't yet exist, like what we're doing at LEV Foundation, is therefore, a no-brainer, an absolute no-brainer. And, neglecting that and seeing such projects not happen as a result of lack of funding is brain dead. Simple as that.
All right. So, okay, talking about this, how people or maybe investors who are interested in longevity, how they can probably support LEV Foundation, maybe for your projects that you have.
All right. So first of all, LEV Foundation is a charity. We're a 501c3, as it's called in the US. So if you give us money, then you get a tax break if you're a US taxpayer. In fact, also if you're a European taxpayer, because we have an affiliate in the EU. But you don't get any money back. You're not it's not an investment, it's a donation. Now, get over it. The fact is people have reasons to support things that do not have to do with getting money back. That's why we have very, very large charities in this world. The problem is we don't have very large charities in longevity. And
Absolutely.
really, I wish we did. There are some exceptions, but they are the wrong kind of exceptions. We've got, well, the biggest exception, of course, is Hevolution, which is essentially a nonprofit and is spending a lot of money. It's not spending as much yet as it advertised that it would spend, but it's getting there. Unfortunately, however, it has so many political, artists to cover, shall we say, that it has become an extremely mainstream organization, which makes its funding decisions on the basis of the usual nonsense, like peer review, and only funds things in the normal way. So it would never write a check for $3 million up front for a project. It's got rules that says it won't do that, and it can't make exceptions because that would piss people off. That is, Hevolution has shot itself in the foot massively by becoming an excessively normal organization, when it did not need to, I don't think.
Right.
The other places that are providing money for this are just vastly smaller, and they don't have nearly enough money to spend on good things. I still have very high opinion of Impetus, which is a granting body that funds small grants, makes very quick decisions, and has definitely done plenty of good, but it's got hardly any money. So, what can you say? And therefore, if anyone who's got deep pockets needs to be looking at the gaps in what is being funded. They need to understand the landscape and not just look at it and say, oh, this is not really important anymore because there's plenty of money. It's not true. The uneven distribution of that money is doing huge harm.
All right, great. So, Koza, maybe before the final item, if you have any question, anything else you want to add? Your mic is...
Yeah. Yes, a question that we haven't asked you, or some final thoughts.
Final thought. Well, I've given a lot of thoughts. No, I think I've basically hit the high points. I mean, I think really the critical understanding that this field still is being held back by lack of money, even though at first glance it doesn't look that way. That's the main thing I want people to understand.
Fantastic. So please let us know that when exactly we can find more about what you're doing, your project, your conferences, the website, YouTube, Twitter, where mostly you are active in more.
Right, yes. So obviously we do have a website. I'm sure you'll put it in the show notes,
Sure.
levf.org, Longevity Escape Velocity Foundation. We run a conference every year, as you know. It's always been a highlight of my year, and these conferences make a huge impact on the field in terms of bringing newcomers together, bringing veterans together, getting more ideas across, forming partnerships and so on. So that's very important for us. Um, and as regards the projects, we have regular updates, roughly once a month, that I put out on social media, and of course they're also archived on levfoundation.org, levf.org. The main social media area that I am most active on is Twitter. But I have an email address, aubrey@levf.org, and I'm very well behaved with my email.
Yeah, fantastic. So finally, actually, I want to tell you something. We have an idea of creating a HealthGevity passport, HealthGevity Nation passport, which has some amazing new features. So we'll send you more information about it. And actually, we would be grateful if you accept and to have it, so that we can be more in touch and just try to expand our nation through other countries. Already we have more than 35 ambassadors in 35 different countries, and we are working on that to achieve to all countries have an ambassador. And through our ambassadors, we try to raise the awareness about, longevity and what we can do and what people can do about it. And so we will send you the information. Anyone who is participating in our podcast, just as a let's say simple gift, we offer them, and we hope you accept it.
You are muted, Aubrey, but we saw that you were thanking.
Yep. Yes.
And
we
are thanking you too.
Yeah.
So thank you so much for being with us in HealthGevity podcast, and thank you again.
And let me know when it goes live, and I'll obviously, tweet about it, and you tweet about it, and I'll retweet and all that kind of nonsense. All right?
Sure.
Live long and prosper.
Live longer and prosper. Yeah. Thank you so much.